Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or maybe just gentlemen this evening. So it's Michael Scott here, and I'm broadcasting to you from sunny California. I had plans to talk to you outside, but it was far too hot, I have to say to you. Temperatures are up in the 90s. So look, thank you for joining me this evening, and thank you for Boys Life for hosting me here this evening. Before we start, I have to give a very, very quick shout out to my very special troop, which is Troop 451. And when I was at the Boys Life Jamboree last year, you see that, Troop 451 took a t-shirt from Troop 1733, and Ryan and Zach and Sean gave me this t-shirt, which is one of my favourites with that great badge, so special shout out to them. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Enchantress, which is the last book in the series, and when I was talking to you all previously, it was the Necromancer. It was book 4, it was this one. And so what we've gone up, last year we had the Warlock with the stunning, spectacular cover. And this year we have the Enchantress, which is the last book. And you know, one of the questions I got when I was at the Jamboree, one of the great questions, and I'm asked it again and again and again, which is why, first of all, did I set this series in America, and why do I spend so much time in America collecting folklore? One of the great answers is that, you know, people think that America has no folklore, that you leave aside the Native American folklores and America hasn't got great folklore. America has actually got some of the best folklore in the world, because what was happening, of course, is when the immigrants are coming in, they're coming in from Europe, they're coming in from Africa, coming up from South America and coming across from Asia, they are bringing with them their music and their songs and their languages and their stories. They brought with them their stories. So America has lots and lots of bits and pieces of world folklore. So America has lots and lots of bits and pieces of world folklore. So as I began to collect folklore all across the world, I kept coming back to America again and again, finding unique stories which no longer existed in the homeland, because when the immigrants had come into America, they had brought with them these great stories. And you know, on the east coast of America, down from Canada all along the east coast, there are some wonderful Irish banshee stories. Ban is the Irish word for woman, and she is the Irish word for fairy. And these are Irish fairy women stories which no longer exist in Ireland. Because when the Great Famine hit Ireland in the 1840s and 1 million people died and 1 million people emigrated, they all came this direction and they brought with them their stories. And the villages and the storytellers within the villages would actually come over here. So as I began to collect this series, or began to do the research for this series, I knew I wanted to set it here. I knew I wanted to set it in America. And you know, it's been a really interesting experiment. It's been a wonderful success. The books are now in 37 countries and 25 languages. And I suppose we have to ask, why is that? Why has this series traveled all over the world? And I think it's because it's built on folklore, and folklore is universal. So that's the basis, the background to the story. I get many questions every single day. I get many hundreds of emails every single day. And a lot of people are asking the same types of questions. And one of the things we did with this, when Boys Life decided that they would do this, and we put out a request for questions, and we got hundreds of questions. And what I've done for you today is I've actually gone through the questions, and I've picked 10 questions, and these 10 questions are representative of so many other questions. And if I read out your name tonight, you have actually won a prize. And what I'd like you to do is I want you to check your email in the morning, because you will get an email from boyslife.magazine@scouting.org. What I want you to do is I want you to ask your parents just to check the spam mail, just to make sure it's not taken into spam, because we're going to need your address just to send you a book. So first of all, thank you for so many questions, some really great questions, some very insightful questions, and in no particular order, so let me start. So the first question is from Tyler F. Tyler, I don't know what troop you're with, but thank you for your question. And Tyler wants to know, where did you get the idea to create the Secrets of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel? And how long, on average, does it take to write a book in the series? That's sort of 2 questions, but I'll answer the easy part first. It takes me about a year to write each book. But before I do the writing, there's a lot of research. And before I even set out to do any books in this series, there was about 10 years of research in total. Because as I began to create the story, which ultimately became The Secrets of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel, I saw that there were 6 very neat breaks in the story, which suggested that there were going to be 6 books. And that suggested it was going to take me 6 years. So I knew I needed to plot, and I needed to plan, And much more importantly, I needed the ending of not only the ultimate book in the series, but I needed the ending of all the books so that I had my destinations. Because once I had my destinations, I needed a story. So I spent about 10 years researching all the books, putting in place all of the bits and pieces of information that I needed for the series. And then I set out to write them. And they take about a year to write. And the idea for the original series was I wanted to create a book based around mythology. I collect mythology, and I collect mythology all over the world, as I've said. And as you do that, you realize that a lot of the stories all across the world are very similar, and some of them are actually identical stories. And I wanted to use some of those stories in an interesting and different way. And I know a lot of you know a lot of the Greek stories, and some of you know a lot of the Roman stories or some of the Egyptian stories. But I wanted to use some of the other world's great myths, some of the Norse stories, some of the wonderful South American stories, the fabulous Chinese stories, and of course the great Celtic stories, which people don't know, which of course is my own heritage. And I wanted to use them in a story. So the original idea came about because I wanted to use world mythology in this way. The original hero was not Dr. D, not Dr. or Nicholas Flamel. The original hero was Dr. D. Dr. John D was the original hero for this series. And like everybody else in the book, it's based on a real man. All of the characters in the Flamel series, with the exception of the twins, Sophie and Josh, are based on fact. So there really was obviously a Shakespeare and a Billy the Kid and a Machiavelli and a Nicholas Flamel. And I know some of you know the name Nicholas Flamel because of the Harry Potter connection. And I still get emails to this day from people saying, you know, did you steal Nicholas Flamel from J.K. Rowling? And the answer is no. Nicholas Flamel was a real man. He was a real bookseller. And one day he bought a book written in a language which he could not understand. And he spent 20 years trying to translate this book. And eventually, with a little help from a scholar he met in the south of Spain, he translated the book. And he became fabulously wealthy, and nobody knows where he got his great wealth from. And Perenelle, his wife, made him put some of that great wealth into churches and hospitals and schools in Paris and France where they lived. And some of those schools still exist today. And in fact, he's so important in Paris that there's actually a street named after him. And there's a street named after Perenelle just around the corner. And the legend has it that Perenelle dies, and then a few years later, Nicholas dies. And on the date of his death, his house is broken into by thieves looking for his money. But of course, the house is empty. The house is just a shell. And then the same thieves dug up his grave because rich people were often buried with their jewels. And the grave was empty. So then they dig up Perenelle's grave, figuring he'd been buried with his wife. And it had never been used. And then a couple of years later, we have a report of Nicholas and Perenelle in Rome. And a few years after that, they're spotted in Berlin. And the legend is that the book that he had found, the book that he had bought and translated, had taught him the two great secrets of alchemy: how to turn ordinary metal into gold and how to become immortal. So he is the hero, but he wasn't the original hero. The original hero was Dr. John Dee. And Dr. John Dee was a real man. He was Queen Elizabeth I's magician, mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and spy. He was the Queen's spy. And he would travel all across Europe spying for the Queen. And when he would send back his notes, he would sign them in a certain way so that she would know they were from him. And his signature was two long ovals that looked like eyes, because he was the eyes of the Queen, and a slash that looks like a 7. And he was the original 007. And when Ian Fleming came to give James Bond the call sign, that's where it comes from. So he was my original hero. He was never the right hero. He's always a little bit too dark. And then in September of the year 2000, I came across Flamel's house in Paris. And it's now a little restaurant, beautiful little restaurant. And I went in there and I had a cup of tea, and I'm looking around this amazing room, remembering what I knew of the original Nicholas Flamel. And I decided that here, this bookseller who buys this magical book, here is the perfect hero for my book. So that's the genesis of the story. So the next question is from Matthew M. Congratulations, Matthew M. Dear Michael Scott, I've been writing a book myself. What tips and tricks would you give to an aspiring writer? The most important thing you can do if you want to become a writer is to be a reader. You have to read. I have never met a writer yet who wasn't a reader. And you have to read everything, not just in any one particular genre. You've got to read right across the genres. If you look at the Flamel series, it has history and geography and math and science and adventure and fantasy. It has all of those things in it because all of those things interest me. So first of all, you become a reader. Read and read and read again. The next thing you have to do if you want to become a writer is learn how to type properly. Take a keyboarding skills course so that you're typing with all 10 fingers and not just 2 fingers. Because if you type with 2 fingers, you're going to wreck your hands and you're not going to be able to type as quickly as the ideas are tumbling out of your head. The next thing you do is you write every single day, and that's just absolutely critical. It doesn't matter if you throw it away the following day. Writing is all about practice, so you have to write every single day. And then finally, get a really, really comfortable chair, because you're going to spend a long time sitting in it. So Matthew, there are my tricks for writing. Our next question comes from Bailey. Congratulations, Bailey. Bailey says, will this book be made into a movie? And the answer is yes and no and maybe is the sort of the long answer to that. There have been, even before the book was published, there was a lot of interest in the movie rights. And the movie originally went to New Line, who had just made Lord of the Rings and were about to make Golden Compass, and they took the rights originally. And then the rights drifted. Lorenzo di Bonaventura, who did Transformers, had the rights next. Barry Josephson, who did Men in Black, had the rights after that. The rights have actually come back to us, and there's some really interesting and very exciting news, which is happening round about now, actually. So if the phone rings as we're speaking, you'll know it's actually a movie deal. So there will be a movie. Now that the 6 books are finished, people can see the shape of the story. The exciting news is that I will actually get to write the first pass script. So it will look more or less like my book, because how often do you see a movie where it doesn't look anything like the books? At least this time it'll bear a resemblance to the book. And that's what's sort of happening now. However, I would say to you, I have discovered as we've gone through the process of trying to do the movies, is that movies take forever. So don't hold your breath. But I am confident now that there will be a movie later rather than sooner. So Rushba S asks me, did you ever think you would become an author when you were 10 years old like me? And the answer is no, I didn't. I never thought about that at all. It was such an odd job. I was a reader. I was reading very, very young, and I was reading very voraciously, and I read every single day. And if you do read an awful lot, there comes a time when you pick up a book and go, I can write better rubbish than this. That's how most writers start, I think. My big revelation came when I was working in a bookstore. And if you work in a bookstore, every single day, boxes and boxes and boxes of books come into you. And some of the authors you'll know, the famous authors you'll know, but a lot of the authors you will not know. You won't know who they are, you've never heard of them, and you ask yourself the question, well, who are these people and how can they write books? And as I'm asking myself those questions, I'm thinking, well, gosh, maybe if they can do it, maybe I can do it too. And I was 19 years of age when I wrote my first book, or decided that I would write my first book. It's still in print today. It's not terribly well written. I wish I could go back in and fix its many mistakes. But at 10 years of age, I was happy just to be a reader. I would have to say to you that I'm just finished my book tour for the Enchantress, and I've travelled all across America, visiting schools and bookstores and libraries. And I met a young man in a school very, very recently who was 12, who had just published his very first book. 12 years of age. And it's a big book. It's a big 40,000 word book. And it would remind you that Christopher Paolini was 15 going on 16 when he published his very first book. So this is a job that anyone can do. If you can tell a lie, which I know you never do, but if you could tell a lie, you can write a book, because a book is nothing more than a huge, big, fat, 80,000 word lie. Now what that means in English is, this is the Enchantress here, this is the Alchemist. The Alchemist is 80,000 words, that's 80,000 words. What that means is, if you were to write on every single line of your school notebook or your school journal, you get about 1,000 words per journal. So a book like The Alchemist is 80 journals full. And The Enchantress, which is a little bit thicker, The Enchantress is 103,000 words. So that's 103 journals. So when you do set out to write your book, it's got to be big. But big comes later. You start small and then grow your stories. But no, I didn't know I wanted to be a writer when I was 10. And I don't think any writer does. But if you are a reader, you'll try it sooner or later. So our next question comes from Tai, T-A-I. And Tai says to me, are you going to make more books detailing the backstory of certain characters, like in The Death of Joan of Arc? And the answer is yes, and I'm working on that right now. One of the great joys in working with this series is that I got to play with all of these characters from all across history. And all of my favourite historical characters are in the story. However, all of the adventures in The Secrets of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel take place just in 2 weeks. So all the action in book 1 is in 2 days, and all the action in book 2 is in 2 days. And by the time we get to the Enchantress, all the action takes place in about 12 hours. That's how short a time frame it is. However, within the story, there are lots of hints about previous stories and characters who've met before and characters who've known each other. Marethu, for example, is 10,000 years old, so we know he has 10,000 years of adventures. We know that Scapap is 2,500 years old, so she's 2,500 years of adventures to tell. I've written 2 short stories which are available digitally at the moment, called The Death of Joan of Arc and Billy the Kid and the Vampires of Vegas. My plan is to write another series of short stories answering some of the questions and filling in some of the background to some of the characters. And when there's enough of those, 10 or 12 stories, I think eventually there will be a book and we'll call it something like The Lost Tales, The Secrets of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel, The Lost Tales. But the answer is yes, there will be more. So Alex wants to know, what was your favourite subject in school and why? It should be no surprise to you that my favourite subjects, because I had 2, were history and English. I loved history and I loved English. I wasn't particularly good at history, but I still loved it. And English I loved to do. And it's interesting that, here I am many, many years later writing. It's also interesting that some of the subjects that I wasn't really good at in school, like Latin and Greek, for example, are topics that I use every single day, because a lot of the folk tales that I'm researching and reading are still in Latin and still in Greek. What school did give me, which was really important, was it gave me the skills necessary to research, because this series is built upon research. And this is one of the things that school gives you. When you're working on your project or working on your essay, you're gathering together life skills that you will use at a later stage. And you come to the Flamel series, you can research every single character, every single place in the series. This is a series set in the real world. It's set in locations that you recognize. It's set in San Francisco and London and Paris, and you can go and you can check this, even the streets. I've given you so much detail. You can follow Sophie and Josh's journey on a street by street level. The only thing I will tell you or suggest to you if you are doing research is for goodness sake, don't be using Wikipedia for your research. I went onto Wikipedia recently to find I was 10 years older than I was. Someone else's books had been added to mine and I had a beard. And I think it was the beard I really objected to. So use your school library, use your proper library for doing your research. But that's what school gave you. I was good at writing essays in school. The trick I used to use in school, which is a trick I use with the Flamel series, is that I would always write the ending first. Because if you write the ending, you have a destination. And once you have your ending to your piece, you know where you're going to go, and it makes the whole process far much easier. So Michael M asks me a question: where do you do all your research to make all the facts to connect to stuff in mythology? I'm a great believer in doing the research at source. So for example, a big chunk of this last book is set in San Francisco, which is a city I love. It's a city I know really, really well, a city I've lived in, a city I've stayed in. But when I was coming to do this series, for example, I spent a long time in San Francisco with my camera, recording everything, because that's what I do. There's a big chunk of this series, of this last book, set on Pier 39. And I spent 2 or 3 days on Pier 39, just walking up and down the pier, photographing everything. So that when I came to write the series, I would have this huge visual library at my disposal. And when I looked at the photographs, I was instantly back in that place again. When I came to do the research on Paris, for example, because a lot of book 2 is set in the catacombs beneath Paris, I went to Paris, I stayed in Paris, I lived in Paris, and I would visit the catacombs every single day. I'm a great believer in doing the research at source. I think it really, really helps. You can read about a place, you can watch it on TV, you can look at it in the movies, but until you've been there, until you've actually stood on those streets and smelled the air and breathed it in the atmosphere and heard the birds and felt the wind on your face, I don't think you can really write about it. So for me, I do the research at source. Alexander M wants to know, do you believe that the Flamels are still alive, as some of the rumours say? I would love to think that they're still alive. I really would. The answer, unfortunately, is probably not. However, here's what we do know about the Flamels. We know that the Flamels were a real couple. We have Nicholas's will. We have the deeds of his shop. We have copies of his notebooks. We have his diaries. We have his books. So we know a lot about him. We know that he was so well respected in Paris that there's a street named after himself in Paranel. The Flamels, however, lived to great old age. This was an age, they were in Paris in the 15th century. When the average age of a person was 30, 35, 40, you were really old. We know that the Flamels were living on into their 80s, which must have seemed like immortals to the average person. They ate very well. They never drank water, which of course water was quite poisonous, and they were drinking wine and beer all the time because that had been brewed, and that was a lot safer to drink than water. There is some suggestion that Nicholas was a vegetarian. There's certainly some suggestion that Parnell was a vegetarian, so they weren't eating meat, so they were eating very, very healthily. They lived long and healthy lives. However, the legends, and there are many, many legends about them, the legends are that they are immortal. The legends are that we have records of them being spotted in Rome after their death. Now, did they fake their deaths to continue working in secret? That's a possibility. So we know they're spotted 4 years after their death in Rome. We know they're spotted 4 years after that in Berlin. And we know they're spotted in England 400 years later. So we know they keep turning up in history all over the place. We know that there are books published by Nicholas Flamel at least 150 years after his death. Now, in truth, they obviously weren't written by him. It's somebody cashing in on the great Flamel name. So, much in all of that, I would love to believe that Nicholas and Parnell are still alive. I reckon they're not here. But if they're still alive, they're probably going to look for royalties on these books that I've just written. So, we'll see. We have a question here from Mackenzie. Mackenzie says, how long did it take you to make the series? As I said before, each book takes about a year to write, about a year in total from start to finish. However, the very first time I came up with the series, conceived of the series, was in 1997, in September of the year 1997. And I know that because, like most writers, I keep a diary, keep a notebook where you write down all your ideas. And in September of the year 1997, I am working on a series called The Alchemist with a Y. I have the Y in it. So that's when the first time the word alchemist is appearing. So it's sometime throughout 1997. As far back as I can go, it's May. And certainly from May to September of that year, I'm beginning to collect research for this series. Because I knew it was going to be a huge series, because I knew it was going to be a very, very long series, I did spend about 10 years in total, a solid decade, pulling together all the bits and pieces and then mapping it out. In total, the 6 books come to about 550,000 words, a little over 500,000 words. But actually I wrote probably 3 times that amount. And I have about 1 million words of notes for this series. So the notes for the series are actually bigger than the series themselves. So that when I'm writing it, I have all my material to hand, I'm able to check it, I'm able to make sure I'm not making mistakes. Because what's changed, of course, as I was writing this series, was that the relationship between the author and the reader changed. I mean, I'm now of the generation of writers where you can get in touch with me, as you are now. I mean, you're seeing me talk to you now. When I was growing up, we never saw writers talk to us, and in fact, most of the writers I were reading were probably dead. When I first started writing many, many years ago, I would write a book, and then about 6 months later, I would get a letter with a stamp on it, proper stamp, which had been sent to my publisher. Now, I write a book, the book is published, and it's within hours. I mean, the Enchantress was launched in Politics and Prose, which is a bookstore in Washington, on the 22nd of May. By the time I got back to the hotel, having just launched the book, there were 48 emails from young men and women who had bought the book, read the book, finished the book, and had questions to ask. That's a big change. I'm available now on Twitter and Facebook, and you can write to me, and if you ask me a question, I will answer your question, as I'm answering your questions now. That's a big change. So if I make a mistake in this series, you're going to call me on it. You're going to catch me out and ask me this question. So certainly that process makes us better writers. I really do believe that. So in total, I think about 1990, if I was to put my finger on a date and say, when did I begin this series? It's 1997. And the last book has just been published in May of this year. So that's a long time. And my final question is to Logan, and congratulations to you, Logan. Logan, what was your favourite book to write out of the series, and why did you enjoy writing it? You know, Logan, I always say my favourite book to write is the last book, which is The Enchantress, because usually I'm so relieved to be finished it. As I wrote these books, they actually became harder and harder to write, because not only was I writing a brand new book, but I was conscious of the previous 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then 5 books behind it. I was conscious of the weight of that story. I had to be extra careful not to make any mistakes which would invalidate something that I'd written. But certainly the last book, I was so relieved to be finished. And one of the great reasons for the relief was, before I started to write the series, I wrote the ending, the ultimate ending. And then just before Christmas of last year, I got to slot in the ending, and it slotted in almost unchanged, so word for word. So I knew I had it right. I knew I hadn't made too much of a mess of it. However, having said that to you, writers talk all the time about books changing their lives, and certainly the Flamel series has changed mine in a very interesting and dramatic way. certainly The Alchemist is and will be my all-time favourite book. People say to me, what is your favourite book? And it's got to be The Alchemist. It was the most fun, and this series has been the most fun I've had writing, pulling together all of these myths from all over the world. But The Alchemist has been a little bit special to me. It really has. It's changed everything. And now here I am 6 years later, just finishing with the Enchantress. So that's been an interesting adventure. It's taught me a couple of lessons. One of the lessons is I will never do a series with cliffhanger endings again. I love the cliffhanger endings. My publishers love the cliffhanger endings. Fans either love or loathe them. But I think more people dislike them than like them, because it means you have to wait a year to see what happens. But now that all 6 books are out, you can read it straight through, so you don't, those cliffhangers are not quite so much of an issue anymore. Well, look, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you, and thank you so much for Boys Life for making this possible. It's interesting, as I'm just back from this tour across America, and I met many of the young boys, the young men who were scouts, who turned up at the Jamboree, whom I spoke to at the Jamboree 2 years ago, who now come to see me in the various cities as I travel across America. And I love that, and that is quite wonderful. If any of you out there want to be writers, there's nothing stopping you. Any one of you now can become writers. And publishers really don't care how old you are. Publishers want to know if you can tell a story. So in a couple of years' time, I think I'd like to be reading your stories. If I haven't answered your questions, I'm sorry. Come and find me on Facebook. Come and find me on Twitter. I have an FAQ on my website, so it may answer some of your questions. And if I have read out your name tonight, do go and check your email in the morning, because you should get an email from boyslife.magazine@scouting.org, just in case it's been swallowed up by your spam, because you don't want to miss your prize. So it's been great talking to you this evening, and I'm going to say good night to you. Take care to you. Bye-bye now.